Hello and welcome to the Racial Equity Webinar Series. My name is Danae Schmidt and I am the Senior Manager of Membership and Coalitions here at the USBC, and I'm so glad to have you join us for today's session. The United States Breastfeeding Committee hosts this series of bi-monthly webinars as part of its efforts to create and model a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion. With funding support from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, this series has focused on building the capacity of the breastfeeding field to apply both an equity lens to inform and guide our external strategies and activities, but also an equity mirror to examine our internal structures, culture, and policies. Access to our webinars is free and open to all stakeholders in the first food field, including USBC's member organizations, breastfeeding coalitions, partner organizations, and individual breastfeeding advocates. Slides for today's session can be found on the public webpage and has also been chatted to you. We understand that not everyone can make it to our live session, so we do record all of our webinars. You'll be able to find the recording of today's session later this week on the webpage or in the Racial Equity Learning community, along with our other archived sessions. For today's session, all participants are in listen-only mode. We have set aside 10 to 15 minutes after the presentation to answer any questions that you may have for the presenters and encourage you to type in those questions during the webinar. And here's how you do it. Go to the GoToWebinar control panel on the right of your screen. If you don't see it, it may be minimized. Just click on that orange tab and it will pop back out. If you scroll down below the audio section, you'll see a tab for questions. When you click on that, it will open up a box for you to type in. If you have any webinar-related problems, please send an email to coalitions@usbreastfeeding.org, and one of our staff members will assist you. And that brings us to today's session, the B.L.A.C. course. The B.L.A.C. course is a full-scope lactation and breastfeeding education course made by and for Black people and individuals supporting Black breastfeeding. This course is designed to be a prep course for aspiring IBCLCs, breastfeeding counselors, and birth workers. This session will provide a framework for understanding how racism impacts breastfeeding disparities and access to human milk in the Black community. Participants will learn how imbalanced and oppressive social structures prevent the inherent right for Black families to provide human milk as the first food. Breastfeeding is the first revolutionary act in healing for the Black community and the start of foundational lifelong health. Restorative justice starts with breastfeeding. I am happy to introduce today's presenters, Ngozi Walker-Tibbs and Tanifer Kamara. Ngozi Walker-Tibbs is a nationally recognized speaker and educator on anti-racism, cultural humility, and maternal child health. She serves as a lactation consultant and childbirth educator at the largest hospital in Western Pennsylvania and with Healthy Start Pittsburgh. She is currently studying to become a certified health coach and fitness instructor, as her passion is health promotion in the African American community. She has worked as a birth advocate for over 18 years to provide a continuum of care to women and their families as they journey through the joys and challenges of childbirth and breastfeeding. Ngozi is a respected member of the African American birth workers community in Pittsburgh and passionately serves with other doulas and educators of color to reduce infant mortality and raise breastfeeding rates in the African American community. Tanifer Kamara was born and raised in Oakland, California. Her passion for activism and supporting women's health began early on as a youth delegate to the United Nations Conference on Women held in Beijing, China in 1995. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology and health education and a master's degree in healthcare administration from California State University, East Bay. Tanifer is an international board certified lactation consultant and certified doula. She is also a mother of 3. Tanifer is dedicated to improving maternal and child health outcomes, reducing birth disparities, and increasing access to quality care for all. Welcome, Ngozi and Tanifer. We are turning it over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. We are so delighted to share with you all today about the B.L.A.C course. B.L.A.C stands for Birth, Lactation, Access, Community, and Culture and Kinship. Breast. I'm sorry. Let me start. Let's see. Minimize this. Okay. So the revolution will be latched. We are the course we've been waiting for, centering equity, inclusion, and social justice in lactation education. The concept behind the B.L.A.C course came from the need to have representation within lactation education. We found that in most lactation education courses, often we did not see images or have perspectives on breastfeeding relating to the people that we serve in our community. So thus began the quest to look into lactation education and create a model that that supports, that educates, and uplifts Black people, Black history, and also teaches others who are supporting Black breastfeeding families to look at Black breastfeeding from a different lens. Next slide, please. Okay. So today we'll be covering breastfeeding rates and systemic racism, the need for Black lactation providers, a call to action, and then we'll end with questions, answer, and discussion. In between this, we will cover some history and link things through to today to bring it all full circle. Next slide, please. Ngozi.
So thank you, Tanifer. So we want to take a few moments and remember those who have gone before us, who have transitioned. We think about Congressman John Lewis, who just left us recently, who had a state funeral. We are grateful for his leadership. We also think of those who have gone before us that are in our family, people that we love. My mother is in that number. And we think of those who have laid their lives down for justice. Some whose names we may not remember, but whose names and the work that they did is so incredibly important. So let's take a moment of silence to remember those that we love, remember those that have given their lives for us. Thank you. Next slide, please. Jennifer, this is you.
So what is the B.L.A.C course? As I said before, the B.L.A.C course is a Black, African American, and diasporic centered lactation course. We offer 45-hour full lactation education, 20-hour lactation training, as well as webinars and learning opportunities throughout the year. Our team consists of myself, Tanifer Kamara, Ngozi Walker-Tibbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Lydia O'Boyd of Southern California, and Felicia Brooks Floyd of Florida, and also Georgia. She's between states. Next slide, please. Ngozi.
My position statement. I am the youngest child of John and Lily Ramsey. I am proud that my mother was born by a Black midwife in rural Alabama in 1942. I am married to my college sweetheart for 29 years, and we have 5 breastfed children ranging in age from 26 to 13. We also have a 1-year-old grandson who is our absolute joy. I have a master's in public health and a bachelor's in maternal child health. I am a doula, childbirth educator and trainer, and IBCLC. I am also studying to be a midwife assistant, health coach, and fitness instructor. I love Black people and strive to promote health in the Black family. My experience as a public health professional, mother, health consumer, and community advocate validates and qualifies my work and authority to speak on this subject. I seek to honor my creator and ancestors through my life by serving my community with my whole heart. I will stand for my sisters and use my voice in whatever platform I am given to promote equity, justice, and healing. Ashe. Next slide, please.
Okay. I am Tanifer Kamara. I am an unapologetically African Black cisgendered woman. My lineage runs deep as I am 7th generation American with African ancestry from the Akan, Fulani, Mandinka, Susu, and Yoruba tribes of Africa. I'm a wife and mother of 3 birthed and breastfed children. And might I also add that I am 38 weeks pregnant with my 4th child. I am the 8th child and only daughter born to my mother. I hold a bachelor's degree in psychology and health education with an emphasis on community health and healing. I'm an international board certified lactation consultant, former WIC peer counselor, and traditional birth infancy doula and postpartum healer, and maternal health strategist. I have over 15 years experience in public, private, and nonprofit sector work in social services, research, advocacy, health promotion, and program implementation. I believe in the advancement of Black maternal health led by, for, and with Black women of all backgrounds, including those without formal education or advanced degrees. My lived experience as a mother, professional, and patient within the system validates my work and qualifies me as an authority on the subject. It is my goal to advance Black maternal health through creative and strategic measures that challenge the status quo and amplify the voices of those most vulnerable. Next slide. Ngazi.
Thank you, Tanifer. So here's a poll for our time today. And you please feel free to answer this question in the chat box. So here's the question. Does the lactation field need to be more racially and culturally diversified? So we would like to hear your thoughts. So please feel free to answer in the chat box. Thank you. Next slide, please. Jennifer, I think you're still muted.
Got it. What?
Okay.
So what are the historical impacts and implications on breastfeeding rates, initiation, duration, and attitudes among Black women today? Let's take a closer look at breastfeeding rates. And we looked at each of our respective states and as well as national rates. And we also looked at what those rates are. And from our experience, the stories, the lived experiences of Black women, and the breastfeeding rates within the Black community. Next slide. So is it race or racism that Black infants are 15% less likely to be breastfed than white infants? Black babies are 9 times more likely to be given formula than white or Latinx babies. Now, for some people, they believe that breastfeeding is a matter of choice. Attitudes and beliefs about who breastfeeds and who doesn't often leads to whether or not a mother gets support with breastfeeding, what information she's given, and how likely she is to be offered formula. In my practice here in Oakland, California, our breastfeeding rates reflect that overall breastfeeding rates are pretty high. But when we look deeply into the community and we talk to moms about their experiences in the hospital, we talk to them about their postpartum experiences, what's happening when they go to take the baby to see the pediatrician, is there's a breakdown. There's a breakdown in breastfeeding. And we see that breakdown because not because, but we see that breakdown in the reflection of the duration of breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding, especially at 3 months and 6 months of life. Next slide, please. So in California, 87.2% of babies are ever breastfed. But by 3 months, we're down to 53% exclusive breastfeeding, and at 6 months, 26.3%. In Pennsylvania, 83.8% of babies are ever breastfed. By 3 months, that number for exclusive breastfeeding goes down to 48.9%, and by 6 months, 25.6%. And in Florida, 82.6% of babies are ever breastfed, while at 3 months for exclusive breastfeeding, it's down by half, 41.6%. And then half of that will continue exclusive breastfeeding at 21.3%. So what's happening here? We've shown growth in breastfeeding initiation rates nationwide. We've shown growth in initiation rates of breastfeeding among Black women. We've also seen that rates of initiation were higher in babies who were born in baby-friendly hospitals. But something is happening when there's such a huge difference and disparity in breastfeeding rates at 3 months and 6 months of life. When the American Academy of Pediatrics, the World Health Organization, all agree and have statements that say that support breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding up to 6 months of life. But for some reason, women aren't meeting their goals, and especially not Black women. Next slide, please. So, the need for Black lactation providers. How many of you are Black lactation providers? And if you're not, how many lactation providers are in your area? Is there a Black lactation consultant or peer counselor or CLC or CLE that you can refer a Black mom to? Who do Black women go to for breastfeeding help? One of the things that we learned was that family history of breastfeeding often results in increased breastfeeding. And we have seen this true for the Latinx community, that often they've seen breastfeeding mothers and grandmothers, generations have breastfed. And so women who have a history of breastfeeding continue to breastfeed. So do we have lower numbers due to systemic racism? You know, what role does breastfeeding peer counselors play? How do we support moms from the hospital to the home? And what is the value of various lactation providers from hospital, birth center, community, home, whatever. Next slide, please. I'd like to bring your attention to this data that was released from USLCA on hospital-based IBCLCs. And from what we see is that majority of hospital-based IBCLCs are RN, that they're mostly English speaking, some Spanish speaking, majority white with a few Black and a few Hispanic or Latino. Also, it appears that the IBCLC profession is a bit older, with majority of lactation consultants falling between the 41 to 50 and 51 to 60 range. Okay. So we need to look at this and look at what is our lactation support workforce look like? Who do they represent? The need for diversity. The Black course is not simply just about just supporting Black breastfeeding, although that is our main focus, but also putting emphasis on the need to diversify communities of color within the lactation field. Next slide, please. So I want to put some things into perspective for you, because if you look at the breastfeeding rates here in the US and you examine attitudes and belief from various different people about Black breastfeeding, you might get the sense that it's not a thing that we do. It's not part of our culture, when in fact it's the opposite. And in learning about lactation within the Black community, it's important that we bring in the historical knowledge. It's important that people understand that breastfeeding is a part of our culture, our ancestry, and our lineage. So one of the things that we cover in the Black breastfeeding course is African civilization and culture. Next slide, please. I am because you are. So we support one another. That comes from the idea that we are not alone in this. Breastfeeding is not something that we just simply do alone. It is something that we do together. It is something that we do as a community. It is something that we do as a collective. In Africa, most women learned how to breastfeed, in most parts of the world in general. People didn't have someone to teach them how to breastfeed. You learned how to breastfeed because you saw other women breastfeed. Next slide. And so still, sub-Saharan Africa leads the world in exclusive breastfeeding. So let the story be told, we would think that Black people any and everywhere around the globe don't breastfeed, or they do so at very low rates. And things are constantly changing and fluctuating as economic and political situations change. But for the most part, breastfeeding is still very much the norm in Africa. Next slide. Representation, images of Black women breastfeeding is very important. If we're not growing up and seeing it, we need to see more images. We need to see what breast conditions look like on darker skinned breast. Okay, So it's important that we incorporate images that show who we are, what we do, and how we do it when it comes to breastfeeding. So in the Black course, you will see majority Black and brown breastfeeding images. Next slide, please. Also, making it the norm in society. Breastfeeding is not taboo and it's not hidden. Even in some of the most modest of cultures, among Muslim women, you still see breastfeeding happening, and no one's batting an eye. It's not odd, it's not weird, it's not gross, it's not disgusting. It's just what it is. It's a part of life. Next slide, please. So we're going back and we're using the spirit of Sankofa to go back and learn the wisdom of our past and build for the future. Because we never question what God or the universe blessed us with until a man asserted that his ideas were superior to what was given naturally. Next slide, please. So today we will learn, and this is a quote from our colleague and sister Lydia Boyd, how Black bodies, our reproductive organs, and our breast milk have been game pieces in white supremacy's social capital. Next slide. So consider how the experiences of enslaved Black women and families have painted a picture of breastfeeding for their children. How elder women who experienced slavery handed over their experiences of motherhood, breastfeeding, and bonding with their children and future generations. I want you to think about the trauma of enslavement over multiple generations. And how does that show up today in the Black community? How slavery has impacted how current elders support and nurture families in their decisions to breastfeed. Next slide. Also acknowledge that we've experienced inhumane physical, emotional, and mental treatment, medical practices during pregnancy and childbirth, malnourishment, okay, the work of the enslaved people until their bones broke, their muscles shredded away from their bone, the molestation of children, women, and men, commonly practiced and normalized still to this day. And people were treated more harshly when they showed human emotions during times of loss. So as we go through this, we unpack all of this. And it's important that this history be acknowledged so that you understand where these attitudes and beliefs around breastfeeding come from, particularly when you're faced with a mother or her family who may be opposed to breastfeeding. Okay, next slide, please. So what is a wet nurse? A person who provides their breast milk to a baby other than their own. And so we have this history of wet nursing, whether it was by force during slavery or whether it was a job that a woman would take, sacrificing her own baby's nourishment, nurturing, and well-being for that of another, either because she had no rights to say no, or because it was a means to sustain her family financially. I think it's important to note that Black women have always had to work and raise babies at the same time. Consider that when most women did not work outside of the household, Black women's history in America has always meant that we had to work. and maybe not afforded time to even heal or recover from childbirth, let alone time to breastfeed or even pump on the job. So the introduction of breast milk alternatives started out probably a whole lot earlier for us than for other women. Next slide, please. So why the wet nurse? Why didn't white women want to breastfeed their own children? Milk supply, maybe perceived that they didn't have enough milk, aesthetic reasons. I'm too pretty. These clothes I wear aren't conducive to breastfeeding. Belief that it may be dangerous. It might hurt. It's an inconvenience. Lactation-induced infertility, and also financial profit. So these were some of the concerns that white women and men had about breastfeeding. And they would rather have someone else feed their babies than them do it themselves. Next slide, please. So there was a lot of wealth that was built on wet nurses. And we know that because history has left us behind information, ads for sale, a wet nurse. The value of a woman who was pregnant or lactating was much higher. So money was made literally on our backs and on our breast. Next slide, please. So for more information on any of that was covered around the history and impact of slavery on Black breastfeeding, I highly suggest you read They Were Her Property by Stephanie Jones Rogers. Also, you should read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington. Next slide. Ngazi.
Thank you. So we have a short video that we wanted to share with you that kind of really brings this home for your understanding. So as Tanifer was talking about the way that Black women's bodies were used, right, to really support the lives and the livelihood of white women, we have to also bring that up to today, how slavery still influenced the economics of Black families today. And as a result of slavery, we are still struggling. This video is very short, and I really want you to watch this and pay attention and think about what you already know. Think about things that you've already seen and how that makes sense today. You can start the video, please. Thank you.
To you the racial wealth gap in America. Explain. Tone Talks brings to you the racial wealth gap in America, explained in 60 seconds. In America, there are 190 million whites, living in just about 82 million homes, while there are 40 million Blacks, living in just over 14 million homes. To truly understand the racial wealth gap, you must look past the income of these families and evaluate household worth. According to demos.org, in total, white American households own 90% of the national wealth. In contrast, Black Americans altogether own less than 2.6% of the national wealth, with most of the small sliver being in the hands of Black baby boomer retirees. Black working age families are largely invisible nationally in terms of wealth. To give a clearer lens, the bottom 50% of American households control only 1% of the national wealth. And of the total 14 million Black households, likely over 10 million Black families fall into this bottom group that owns nearly no wealth. The racial wealth gap is real and it's growing. While 10%, or about 8 million white homes, are worth $1.4 million or more, according to Slate.com, when you deduct the family car, 50% of African American homes or over 7 million Black families, are worth no more than $1,700. Subscribe to learn more at tonetalks.org.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So again, as we are, in essence, trying to recover from slavery, it has also affected the economics of Black families today. Next slide, please.
Miriam, we can still see the YouTube. There we go.
Yep, thank you. So let's talk about assumptions. What kind of assumptions do we often face as Black women? Sometimes we hear questions like, do Black women really want to breastfeed? What kinds of assumptions are we making about Black women in the hospital and at delivery, at home and at work, when they return to school? We have to ask ourselves these questions, and here's an example of a situation that I was faced with. In a hospital setting, childbirth and breastfeeding classes were recommended for the community, including the Black community. So as a result, this particular hospital put up wonderful glossy brochures. They distributed them around the hospital, even in the community, and they were wondering why Black families were, for the most part, not attending these courses. It is important to mention that on these glossy brochures were primarily white families. There might be an occasional token Black family, but for the most part, these glossy brochures, they were beautiful and brightly colored, did not really show Black families that they should be a part of these classes. So, as a result, very few Black families came to the childbirth or breastfeeding classes. The situation was presented to me as such. We did our best. We offered the classes. We even offered the classes at various times during the day, and Black families didn't come because perhaps they don't care about breastfeeding and childbirth education. Without taking into consideration that representation matters. So assumptions were made that Black families did not care about childbirth education or breastfeeding, and they were the ones that were blamed. So we have to be careful with the assumptions that we're making. We need to make sure if we want Black families to show up to our classes, we need to present information from a Black lens. And that's why the Black course is so very important. It is also important to mention that many Black women, many Black birthing folks are returning to work much sooner than their white counterparts. Some Black mothers are returning to work even after a cesarean birth as early as 2 weeks. Often Black families are disproportionately represented in jobs that require them to be on their feet for long periods of time, work long hours for low wages. And many of these folks that are in the workforce have children under the age of 3. So what can we do to change what is happening for Black women so that they can meet their breastfeeding goals? Many Black women have shared with me in my private practice and also in a nonprofit that I started 6 years ago called the Pittsburgh Black Breastfeeding Circle, that their employers gave them a difficult time when they discussed pumping for their child. Some employers even threatened to fire these mothers if they asked for time off to pump. When they were presented with the Affordable Care Act, even when mothers worked for longer hours, they still were not given the same as their white counterparts. And as a result, many of the Black women that spoke to me about these issues discontinued breastfeeding much sooner than their white counterparts. So we need to be careful with the assumptions that we make. We need to really serve families where they are and provide evidence-based support prior to pregnancy, during pregnancy, in the hospital, and in the postpartum period. Next slide, please. How about non-consensual treatment? As Jennifer touched on, and we get much more in depth with this in our Black course. There were assumptions made about Black women's bodies that we did not feel pain, that we were also punished. We were punished by the slave owners when we showed emotion. And some of those ideas have even come down throughout the years. They've been passed down and are even still a part of the teaching that occurs in some of our university settings. And as a result of those beliefs, some have not even respected the Black woman's body when she is breastfeeding. So you have to ask yourself this question, many of you that are lactation providers, before you've touched a woman's body, before you've touched a Black woman's body, did you ask for consent? As OB providers, do you ask for consent before you touch her body? At delivery, do you ask for consent to do a cervical check or to touch her breast to help her latch her baby? How about when she comes to you for well child checks? Do you ask for permission to touch her or her child? How about in a private lactation setting or clinic? Do you ask for consent? If these are not done, Black women continue to suffer from the objectification of their bodies. And that translates into disrespect, and she does not get a chance to experience body autonomy. Black women need to be listened to and respected and receive respectful care. Next slide, please. As we think about our call to action, some of you may remember, it's been several years now, that our Surgeon General, who was a Black woman, Dr. Regina Benjamin, she published the Surgeon General's call to action to support breastfeeding in 2011. I was so excited when this document came out that I downloaded the whole 98-page document onto my iPhone 3 and read every single page. In the executive summary, Dr. Benjamin talks about what we can do to support breastfeeding for all families, taking into consideration that Black and Brown communities have lower rates of breastfeeding. Here's what she says. One of the most highly effective preventive measures a mother can take to protect the health of her infant and herself is to breastfeed. However, at this time when it was published, 75% of mothers start out breastfeeding, with only 13% of babies are exclusively breastfed at the end of 6 months. And then she adds, additionally, rates are significantly lower for African American infants. The decision to breastfeed is a personal one, and a mother should not be made to feel guilty if she cannot or chooses not to breastfeed. The success rate among mothers who want to breastfeed can be greatly improved, and this is where we come in, through active support through their families, friends, communities, clinicians, healthcare leaders, employers, and policymakers. Given the importance of breastfeeding for the health and well-being of birthing people and children, it is critical that we take action across the country to support breastfeeding. And for our intents and purposes, we are specifically focusing on Black families. As you saw in Jennifer's section, she showed you that Black babies are receiving formula supplementation at much higher rates than white babies in those early days in the hospital. You've seen a lot of news information about the importance of the microbiome and how that bacteria in our gut influences future health. If we are introducing formula to Black babies early, we are also going to see increased rates of illness in Black babies. We have to find out why. Why are Black babies disproportionately given formula in those early days? Is it because certain providers, including nurses, believe that because the breastfeeding rates are lower amongst Black women, that they are not going to go the extra mile to encourage her? If so, then we have work to do. Training is needed for our hospital staff, and that's where Baby Friendly comes in. Part of Baby Friendly is that anyone who is going to encounter this lactating person should also have breastfeeding information. Perhaps we need to go back to the drawing board and understand where our bias influences how we serve. Also, with this call to action, advocacy, how are we advocating for families? And what does it mean to be a true ally for Black birthing families in the hospital and in the community? But we also want to go a step further. Being an ally is just acknowledging that maybe Black breastfeeding rates are lower. But being an accomplice or a co-conspirator is enacting policies in the hospital setting, in the community, in the city, in the state, nationally, that can encourage Black women to breastfeed. And that can start small and trickle out. We can really encourage Black women to breastfeed. And taking the Black course can help do that. We need more providers that understand history and how we can encourage our Black families. Next slide, please. So let's talk about how formula made its way in our nation, but also in Black families. So we heard from Tana for how breastfeeding was normalized and is normalized on the African continent. But unfortunately, because of slavery, Black women's bodies were used to give life and preserve life, but they were not afforded the opportunities to embrace the joys of motherhood. Instead, Black women bore the results of its exploitation and extortions. Our pain and our tears were often noticed but ignored. So when we think about commercial formula and how it made its way into the Black community, let's talk about how formula was made. Human milk alternatives were often made from animal milk that was determined by which animals were available. That could include cows, sheep, donkeys, camels, horses, or goats. The chemical analysis of human milk began to appear in about the 18th century. After comparing human to animal milk was proven to be the superior food. However, there was a desire to give women a break, if you will, and to develop a human milk substitute. Food sterilization techniques in sealed containers were developed in 1810 by Nicholas Appert. Evaporated milk was patented in 1835 by William Newton. Sugar was added to the milk in 1853, and it was sold and canned under the Eagle brand, which became a popular infant food. In 1865, chemist Justus von Liebig developed, patented, and marketed an infant food first in a liquid form, then in a powdered form to preserve it better. Liebig's formula consisted of cow's milk, wheat and malt flour, and potassium bicarbonate, and at that time it was considered the perfect infant food. In 1885, unsweetened condensed milk was developed by John B. Meyerling and labeled as condensed milk. Here you see on this slide some advertisements from 1950 and 1930. So here you see an actual thing here for people to notice. These are billboards that says nurse your baby. It also compares breastfed babies to bottle-fed babies, and we see that the death rates were higher in bottle-fed babies. So imagine the concern that breastfeeding supporters had with competing with formula companies. Even though we saw that breastfed babies were healthier, but this condensed milk was now on the market and was wooing families to try this new product. Next slide, please. This is from Lactogen, and this is taken directly from the Smithsonian's website. Lactogen is manufactured by the Nestle company, the Swiss firm founded by pharmacist Henry Nestle, who was the inventor of the first fully artificial infant milk formula. It and other commercial pediatric formulas of the time attempted to reproduce the nutritional formula found in breast milk. Companies continue to try all of these different ways to replicate breast milk. Nestle introduced Lactogen and Franklin Foods Similac soon after. These new products gained the trust of the medical establishment first, and in the 1950s, we saw a sharp increase in infant formula use within the United States. And then infant formula peaked within the 1970s, when approximately 75% of American newborns received formula instead of being breastfed. The reasons for this increase include successful marketing campaigns, including the provision of free products, mid-century consumer confidence in scientific products, and the acceptance of infant formula's nutritional value by nurses and pediatricians, plus the increase of women in the workforce. The year that I was born, 1971, the breastfeeding rates were at some of the lowest since we had started to document those. Next slide, please. So as we talk about formula and how 75% of families were giving formula in the 1970s, we want to go back to this tragic story of the false quadruplets. The false quads, as they are commonly called, were born in 1946 in North Carolina. These four beautiful girls and their families were exploited by their physicians and the pet milk company. Their Black Cherokee mother was deaf as a result of a childhood illness. Her husband was a tobacco farmer. They were a poor, large family of 6, and the physicians and nurses took it upon themselves to exploit their financial need. Their physicians experimented on these girls by giving them highly doses of vitamin C, and the doctors even went as far as naming the girls after their family members and then adopted by another family in 1952. A home and land were purchased for the girls to further exploit their family, even to the point of their childhood home being thought of as a type of human museum. White families would come and observe the 4 little Black girls playing in the window. Throughout their lives, the false quads were treated like exotic animals with a high price tag. Marketing efforts were of the highest order to get Black women to purchase pet milk to feed their babies. And it was a very aggressive campaign. To this day, there is no mention of the girls or their families or their contributions to the pet family milk products, almost as if they never happened. But we have receipts, and we know that this family existed and their story deserves to be told. It is also very important to mention that all 4 of the false quads girls died of breast cancer in their 40s. Next slide, please. And again, we're just touching, we're giving you some highlights on what we discuss in the Black course. There's a lot more to learn about the false family. So we know the human milk banks have been very instrumental to providing milk to premature infants. Very important because premature infants are often born with compromised immune systems, and they are unfortunately at an increased risk of infection and growth issues. Due to systemic racism in all aspects of our society, including medicine, Black mothers experience premature deliveries at much higher rates than their white counterparts. That understanding, we are grateful for milk banks in our world that, like giving blood, seeks others for donations and provides screenings that rule out infections or diseases of donors. Human milk is pasteurized, which uses heat to kill viruses and bacteria while still preserving the majority of nutrients. And I realize, again, we're preaching to the choir. Some of this information you already know. However, companies like B.L.A.C., who processes human milk, try to exploit this need by attempting to pay insultingly low amounts of money to Black mothers in Detroit, Michigan. They targeted the city because, due to systemic racism, Detroit's Black community suffers severe financial hardships. B.L.A.C.'s exploitation was halted by Black breastfeeding leaders in Detroit and around the country. To the unsophisticated eye, might look like this was actually a good thing that they were willing to pay mothers. But the reality is that Black women would have made far less than their milk was worth in a community that had a high infant mortality rate. Furthermore, this community was not even slated to directly benefit from this donated milk. But under the leadership of Kimberly Seals Ayers and Kadada Green, an open letter was sent to B.L.A.C. calling them out. Hundreds signed on, and B.L.A.C. eventually rescinded their campaign in Detroit and other cities. We are proud that our sisters made that happen, and we have to remain diligent and not fall asleep on the job as more work needs to be done. There are organizations that wish to exploit Black women and their Black bodies. Next slide, please. So when we think about the newborn nursery, there was a time when all babies went to the nursery following delivery. If mother was breastfeeding, the baby was brought to her on maybe a very limited schedule, sometimes maybe every 4 to 5 hours. But the newest research says that when babies are able to room in with their mothers, they get to know each other. Mother picks up on those feeding cues so that those babies can figure out how to latch on to the mother's breast. However, there are certain hospitals that still encourage the mother to get some rest and they take the baby to the nursery. This proportionately happens to Black families. We need to make sure we are training our providers in our hospitals to encourage families, keep babies close to them. Talk to families about normal infant behavior. Talk to families about feeding cues and how to tell when the baby is hungry. Next slide, please. This is you, Jennifer.
So how do we heal going forward? We need to validate our trauma. You need to understand post-traumatic slave syndrome, what it is, and what it looks like, how to support Black families, and what is healthy and appropriate allyship. Next slide. So the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. So we all suffer from trauma, no matter what side of it that we on, whether we are the victim or the one who is the victimizer. And one of the people I deeply respect, Dr. Joy DeGruy, talks a lot about this in post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so I highly recommend, if you've not read her books or heard any of her lectures, that you do so. Because just as we have to heal from our trauma, other folks have to heal if they were a witness to the trauma that we experienced, or if they have inflicted that trauma upon us. Next slide, please. So no one can be liberated under the weight of oppression. So the only way out is to go through. And the reason why we included post-traumatic slave syndrome in our lactation education course is because we need to understand what happened in the past and how that shows up today. And so Dr. DeGroot, she tells a story of, two mothers. And you have a black mother, you have a white mother. And the white mother is complimenting the black mother on her black son, how smart and, intelligent he is. And the black mother, makes disparaging remarks, about her son. But the white woman speaks highly of her son. And I'm paraphrasing that story, but the idea behind it is, where does that comes from us trying to protect our children. If you had to worry about your child being sold during slavery, and the slave master comes over and says, oh, young Abraham is growing mighty fine. And you're going to be like, oh, no, no, no. That boy is lazy, shiftless, his left foot, don't work. He walk with a limp. He can't talk right. You're going to make disparaging remarks to preserve and protect your child. And so these things have been passed down. And in our subconscious, we don't even know where it comes from anymore. So when you encounter Black women who may have negative attitudes or beliefs about breastfeeding, understand the historical impact. Understand where those attitudes and beliefs came from, because she may not even be aware that this has been passed down. Okay. Also, take into consideration the sexualization of the Black woman, the sexualization of breast, and the need to keep that hidden, to keep that private. That somehow by breastfeeding your baby, you're exposing or opening yourself up to unwelcomed attention. Okay. So post-traumatic slave syndrome really dives deep into the attitudes and beliefs that carried over from slavery and show up today, whether conscious or subconscious, whether we know that that's the origin or not. That is the fact and that is the reality. And we must address that, and we must bring that lens and that view into lactation education. Next slide, please. So what is post-traumatic slave syndrome and its impacts? It is an adaptation to survive. It is survival behaviors in African American communities throughout the US and the diaspora. Now, interestingly enough, throughout the diaspora, many women still do breastfeed and have a legacy and history of breastfeeding that is still intact, although that is changing and has changed over the years as formula has become more prevalent throughout the diaspora and Africa as well. Okay. Also, understanding that we must change our language. People say that slaves were taken from Africa. That is not true. People were taken from Africa and were made into slaves. So how we even talk about history, how we even talk about people. I don't refer to African or Black people as being former slaved. We were enslaved. And one of the earliest lessons I learned in lactation was in language, how we communicate and say things. You know, oftentimes it is said that breastfeeding, you know, not breastfeeding leads to higher incidence of, you know, ear infection. But why can't we just say formula? Formula feeding leads to higher incidence of ear infection. So same concept when you're speaking of Black people and descendants of slavery. Be careful of your language and use enslaved instead. Okay. So let's talk about MAP, multi-generational trauma together with continued oppression. Absence of opportunity to heal or access the benefits available in the society leads to post-traumatic slave syndrome. Okay. So breaking that down is we have one earlier generation, something traumatic happened. As a result, they adapted to their situation and they passed on whatever survival mechanism that they had. Okay. So if your great grandmother was not allowed to breastfeed, and let's say that baby was being fed pot liquor and cornbread and sugar water. And so the next person growing up, they learn that this is what you feed the babies because they didn't see someone breastfeed and they didn't have an opportunity to heal from that. And that gets passed on. But at some point, we actually did reclaim breastfeeding. At some point, we actually did reclaim, you know, our practices around birth, around healing ourselves. And even that was almost nearly taken from us. Okay? Through systemic and structural racism and practices. And many people today don't know about those things. The disenfranchisement of the Black midwife, the Black healers, the Black herbalist. Okay. So when those things are taken away and you're promoted this new product and you're given these pretty pictures of these 4 little Black girls growing and thriving on pet milk, you begin to believe that that is superior. And so then we have this transition of breastfeeding because that was all we had. And then the marketing and the not just marketing, but intentional marketing of breast milk substitutes, artificial baby milk to Black communities. And so that means my mother's generation, my grandmother's generation, my great grandmother's generation, even, were less likely to breastfeed. And however they fed those infants were passed down. I didn't see breastfeeding in my immediate family. But I did see other Black women in my community who did breastfeed. And that allowed me to change the narrative for myself and also for my family to create a culture of breastfeeding. And that is where the healing comes in. And that is what the goal of the Black course is. is to bring in that healing so that we can move forward. Next slide, please. So we know that post-traumatic slave syndrome has an impact on breastfeeding. And like our good friend and colleague, Dr. Clifton Keenan says, race is not a factor on health outcomes. Racism is a factor on health outcomes. So I want you to think about how racism and racist beliefs show up when it comes to supporting Black women with breastfeeding. Next slide, please. So how do we support Black families? How do you support Black families? At the root of what's happening to Black women and their birth outcomes, as well as their disparities with breastfeeding, is an issue about racism and bias. Do you have untapped bias? And when I ask these questions, it's not just directed toward white people, because even Black people may hold biases. Breastfeeding is that one thing in healthcare that a lot of people rely on their own personal experiences and views about it without really using the evidence that exists. And I know you all know what I'm talking about because you've heard it. You know, we see it with nurses, we see it with doctors. If a healthcare provider was successful at breastfeeding, she's more likely to have a positive attitude about breastfeeding and supporting women with breastfeeding. Okay. So the racism and bias may be from folks of another ethnic group who feel like they can't relate to Black women, or it may be internalized in that other Black folks could also perpetuate some of the bias in support of breastfeeding. And again, where does that come from? It comes from not having the healing. It comes from not understanding and not knowing the history. It comes from not really looking deeply at one's own failure, success, experience, desire, and attitudes around breastfeeding. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So again, I want to reiterate that Black mothers were 9 times more likely to be given formula in the hospital than white mothers. This fact alone accounted for about 20% of the racial disparities in breastfeeding duration between Black and white mothers. Not too long ago, there was a post in one of the lactation groups on Facebook from what I believe to be was a white lactation consultant. And she had an issue around nipple shields and believed that nipple shields, she had difficulty getting nipple shields to adhere to Black women's breast. And she posed a question within the group. And it is things like that. It is those subtle, microaggressions. It is those subtle attitudes and beliefs that because I can't get this nipple shield to adhere to this Black woman's breast, there must be something inherently wrong or different about Black women's breast that a nipple shield won't adhere to it. And many people spoke on this. Many people addressed the issue. But it is those types of beliefs It is those types of experiences and occurrences that happen every day that prevent Black women from getting the help and support they need. Is it really that there was a difficulty getting this nipple shield to adhere to this Black woman's breast? Was it really about the fact that she was Black? Or was it that the person providing care lacked the experience, knowledge, wherewithal, or care to actually support this mom with breastfeeding? I don't know. I'm not judging her, but this came up. And this is why we created the Black course, to address these specific issues. Because what that comes from is a lack of education within lactation about differences or similarities in Black women's skin. Having gone through a whole 90 hours of training and see very few images of darker, more melanated breast and skin tones. Next slide, please. So Ngozi, how do we support Black families?
Thank you. Well, we support Black families by listening to Black women. I also want to share a story that's important that a Black mother shared with me with tears in her eyes, that she requested help from a white nurse at the local hospital, and the nurse told her that she could not help her breastfeed her child because her nipples were too dark and she could not see how to help her latch her baby. These are the kinds of things that Black women are dealing with in our hospitals. Sadly to say, this mother wept. She told me the story. She did not breastfeed her daughter as long as she wanted to because she felt like something was wrong with her body and she felt embarrassed. This woman was a nurse and an IBCLC with 30 plus years experience. And she told this mother that her nipples were too dark, so she couldn't see how to help her latch her baby. So how do we support Black families? We listen to Black families if there are areas that we are uncomfortable with in regards to supporting this Black family. We got to ask ourselves why. Where does that come from? What kinds of experience have we had in our primary education about Black families? Many of us have had very little. Many of us have had very little or very few encounters with people who look differently than us. So in order to support Black families, we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to go back. Maybe we need to look at pictures in some of our books of Black women's breasts to get more familiar. Thrush may look different on a Black woman's nipple than an Asian woman's nipple. Crack in the nipple may look different on a Black woman's breast. So we need to also make sure that we, in our own sphere of influence, are encouraging Black birth workers to get this lactation education so that they can support women that look like them. Representation matters. If you are a professor at a university or a hospital or a clinic, that's where you are working. Look at your recruitment efforts. Are you going to high schools and recruiting Black students to learn more about lactation, to learn more about birth work? That's how we support Black families. By starting from the drawing board with recruitment, by addressing our own biases, by dealing with our own issues. If we've had an uncomfortable encounter with someone that looks different than us, we are addressing those, and that's how we support Black families. Next slide, please. We listen to Black women. We honor their traditions, even if they are different than what we are used to, different than what we learned in school. We are listening and honoring their traditions by asking respectful questions. We are not touching Black women's bodies without asking for permission. We are not making judgments about the size of her body, whether she's a small woman or a large woman. I still remember to this day having to receive a catheter by a nurse due to my preeclampsia and blood pressure levels at stroke. My blood pressure numbers were stroke level, being very afraid because I had never had a catheter before, being very afraid that I was going to stroke out and leave my husband with 5 children to raise on his own. I was very vulnerable in those moments. And instead of this nurse being compassionate, she instead made comments about how big my legs were, and that may be the reason why I didn't feel the effects of the magnesium sulfate. Where did she get that idea that that was okay to say to someone in such a vulnerable situation? We need to stop policing Black bodies and families. The size of my thighs had nothing to do with the respectful care that I should have received. We want to normalize breastfeeding in the Black community, and one of those ways is to have providers take the Black course to learn more about the history of breastfeeding on the mother continent, about the history of breastfeeding during enslavement, about the history of breastfeeding during the 1930s and 40s, about the exploitation of Black bodies, and how do we practice Sankofa and go back and fetch it, go back to the beginnings and share this evidence-based passion information with Black families. That's how we normalize breastfeeding in the Black community. We need to encourage more Black providers to learn more about breastfeeding. Providers have shared with me that they spent very little time on human lactation in med school. Part of normalizing breastfeeding in the Black community is teaching breastfeeding in med schools for more than just 1 hour lecture. Perhaps the Black course needs to be in our med schools. Prepare our students, prepare residents to serve Black families. We normalize breastfeeding by having Black women nurse their babies in public, whether that be covered or uncovered, but that it's not something that we're ashamed of, but something that we do in community, something that we are supported by our community. That's how we normalize breastfeeding. Next slide, please.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about bias.
Yes.
And I touched on it just a bit earlier, but we really want to uncover bias, whether it be explicit or implicit. And in implicit bias, it's expressed indirectly. Maybe you're unaware of it, it's subconscious. You know, one example is property manager doing more criminal background checks on African Americans than whites. Okay. Implicit bias in breastfeeding, you know, comes out when you have folks who assume that because she's Black, that, well, the last Black mom I had didn't breastfeed, so I'm just going to give her formula before she even asks for it. Implicit bias is the beliefs that we hold that may have been passed down from one generation to the next. Implicit bias, it comes out when you least expect it. You know, it comes out in just casual talk. I can't tell you how many times I've witnessed and experienced it while receiving report from pediatricians, from hearing nurses how they speak about Black birthing women. So, Ngozi, tell us a little bit more about explicit bias.
Yeah, so explicit bias, as you can see some of the descriptions here, not as common today as implicit bias is, but I've heard older people say, older Black people say, that although explicit bias was more dangerous because it also could result in physical harm, in some ways it was easier because you knew who your enemy was.
Yes.
Because they told you quite plainly, I don't like Black folks. Explicit bias still exists in our hearts and comes out as implicit bias. It dictates who we trust and allow in our space, including where we work and we worship. How many people honestly believe that Black people are less trustworthy, and as a result, they purposely don't hire Black people for their organizations? So their implicit bias manifests itself in implicit bias. When you refer to people from whole countries, that's explicit bias. When you tell people to go back to where they came from, that's explicit bias. So there are people who are leaders in our nation who feel free to exhibit their explicit bias. And it comes out in policies and procedures that our nation exhibits. Next slide, please.
So it looks like we have 1 minute for questions.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Ngozi. Thank you, Tana, for that. Wow, amazing, powerful presentation. We so appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share with us. We can have one question and one quick response if possible, and that's, can you just maybe just share what the importance is of ongoing anti-racism training within the lactation field?
Yes, so the importance is that communities of color are increasing throughout the US. And it's important that we continue to do our own work, and that we are providing non-biased care to all people. I believe that as a Black lactation consultant, you know, we have the ability to transcend race when it comes to supporting other people, even people who aren't Black, because of that experience that we've had and the experience that we've had with racism. And so we come into you know, our work with compassion. So even as a Black lactation consultant, when I encounter people of other cultures or ethnicity, I come in not only to teach but also to learn. And so I think if we all carry that concept, that we have just as much to learn from our patients and clients as we have to give. And we must continue the learning process, and never feel like we know everything there is to know about a certain person, people, or culture.
Agreed. There's nothing really to add to that. I couldn't have said it better.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for presenting, again, such a powerful presentation. We will make the recording available to those of you who are interested on the website. We have just a few quick announcements for you all. If you are able to stay, then we would love to share those with you. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly here. Okay. So as you all may know, over the past few years, we have hosted 4 webinar series, translating to about 24 webinars a year. Over the next few months, we are going to be revamping the way in which we host our webinars. So please stay tuned for new topics, platforms, and possible continuing education opportunities from the USBC. So stay tuned. Finally, we also just want to share this exciting opportunity launching next week as part of the USBC's National Breastfeeding Month activities. As you all know, the National Breastfeeding Conference and Convening is usually an in-person annual event that brings together breastfeeding-focused representatives across the country. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the in-person 2020 NBCC was canceled and reimagined as a robust series of 6 web-on-demand sessions. So each of these on-demand sessions features a breakout panel with 2 or more presentations centered around a common theme. The USBC has actually applied for continuing education for these sessions, and the status is pending, and the website will be updated as sessions are accredited. To see a full list of presentations and the descriptions, be sure to visit the NBCC Reimagined webpage at usbreastfeeding.org/NBCC 2020-reimagined. Each of these sessions will be released on the date that's indicated next to its title, and then once that session is released, you'll be able to register for the session free of charge. We'd also like to give a special thank you to Lactation Education Resources for partnering with us by hosting these sessions within their learning management system. So be sure to visit that webpage to get a preview of the program. So that brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you to all of you who were able to stick around. Thank you for tuning in and for all you do to improve the lives of women, children, and families. Goodbye for now, and well wishes for a joyous National Breastfeeding Month. Take care.